A 2020 look at electronics for your boat or on your boat. So I'm Jeff Cote, by the way, with Pacific Yacht Systems, owner-operator of that business. And at my core, I'm a boater, right? And I hope that's going to come through today in the presentation. Boating is not a hobby, it's a lifestyle. And as part of that lifestyle is getting places safely or being willing to go further to places that otherwise without a navigation system you wouldn't have gone. I can flash back to 2007 when I went around Vancouver Island and I went to certain anchorages that I otherwise would have never been or gone to without a radar overlay or a good chart plotter. Yes, I have charts on my boat. I remember buying all the charts for Vancouver Island at the time. It was over $2,000 worth of charts, paper charts, and they're beautiful. But what we're going to be talking about today is not just navigation with paper charts, or we're going to be talking with electronics. Some of you are going to get a sense a little bit. We write a column every month about these topics in Pacific Yachting, and also in a magazine called Northwest Yachting in Seattle and Washington State and Oregon, also California. So if you feel like geeking out, all those articles, actually, you don't even have to be a subscriber. You can actually find all those articles on our website as PDFs and HTML. They're all there for free. So even if you don't have a Pacific Yachting article and you want to read about chart plotters or anything that we would have written about on those topics, you can find them on our website. The other big takeaway, and we're not going to be talking about too much about NMEA today in terms of safety, but when you are doing electronics for your boat, I would encourage all of us, right, as a boater, to take the time to do the install properly. I can't tell you how frustrating it's going to be, and it's almost like Murphy's Law, right? The day that you're going to need radar is the day that it won't work, and if it's because you didn't install it properly or sort of did the electrical not so great when you were doing it, take the time to do the installation of your electronics or navigation system for your boat to do it sort of well. And there's standards to follow, and with regards to electronics, it's the National Marine Electronics Association. ABYC is another association, and that's more related to electrical. But there's a good way of doing it, and there's a, I hope things are going to work out for me, way of doing things. And I really think that we should all take the safety road, do it properly, make sure that it's as reliable as possible so that we don't have frustration or frustrations later down the road. So our business, Pacific Yacht Systems, and what I'm going to be sharing with you today is we get invited, and I take this as an honor. We did 1,000 boat projects last year. That is both scary as a business owner that used to know everything about every single client that I used to work on or do work for. Now it's way bigger than one person. We're a team of 15. And I just want to say that experience of helping other boaters make the right navigation equipment choices for their boat is what I'm going to be sharing with you today. The other thing some of you might know, we're a really big proponent of YouTube and sharing our knowledge. So if you ever want to revisit this presentation, or we're about 165 videos on YouTube right now, and there's another about 30 that have actually been done but yet to be published. So within 3-4 months, we'll probably be at about 225, 250 videos on YouTube. All do it yourself. I don't think they're salesy, pretty educational, and just about sharing our knowledge and educating boaters like ourselves, making the right choice. I was talking in the booth this morning, and I was saying it's better to spend time today educating yourself and doing the installation once than purchasing a bunch of equipment, installing it, and then coming to the realization that it was the wrong choice for your boat. The good news is there's a lot of choice. The bad news is there's a lot of choice, right? So educate yourself. So the next thing we're going to be, this is sort of a rough agenda of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to make sense of all the options that you have because there's a lot of choice out there, right, with regards to navigation. And then we're going to go through round robin chart plotter. We're going to look a little bit at apps at the end, actually, depth sounder, radar, AIS, autopilot, cameras. And we're going to go through different sort of categories. As an engineer, I like lists. I like sort of folders. And so all this presentation is done per category group, okay? So the first thing that you've got to realize as a boater, and I think this is sort of both good news and bad news, is that when you're deciding on what's going to work for your boat, please don't be tempted to simply look at what your neighbor's doing. You know, you could have another fellow owner that has the identical same boat as you do, that's a boater just down the dock from your boat, but it doesn't mean that they're using the boat the same way you are, right? And all of us have different budgets. It's not so much to say the money you have, but it's the money you want to invest in that part of your boat right now. As we all know, boats can be sort of humbling financially, so we might all start with a different prioritization list, right? Like there's multiple buckets on your boat of what you're going to spend money on. One of them is maybe electronics and navigation. And within that realm of choices that we're going to talk about, remember, every one of us, there's not really two of us that are the same when we're boating. Like I have a lot of boaters that have, let's say, a Grand Banks 42. I've done literally probably 50 different Grand Banks 42 projects. None of them are the same. Every one of us are using our boats differently. So it's important to not just copy, but think it's not what they have, it's what do I need on my boat. So the first criteria in selecting that is deciding what sort of boating preferences are you doing. Are you, for example, a day boater, simply going out for a day and then coming back? Are you going dock to dock? Are you going further and further afield? Are you going to be going off a 3-month journey up to Alaska on the outside of Vancouver Island? Are you going offshore? Or are you always going to the same spots, maybe the Gulf Islands here locally, and you're only doing a weekend trip? Those are going to be factors that are going to influence your decision. So don't forget that. The other really important takeaway is I rarely, and I mean rarely, ever start or do an electronics project on a boat and I rip everything that was on the boat. Honestly, there's some projects we do that are $200,000 in navigation equipment, crazy bridges, and trust me, there's stuff on that bridge that stayed. They don't need to rip it all out. Sometimes it's the autopilot. The autopilot still works. My autopilot is working great. I don't need to change it. Or it might be, I have a VHF radio. It's DSC. So it means distress signal call. I can have it integrated with NMEA. I can do a 911 sort of call with it. Don't need to change it. So it's not about saying, I'm changing my electronics and I'm going to rip it all of it out. There are generally some things on our boat, most of the time, that can still be kept. And that's a way to reduce your costs, right? So you don't have to do everything. There's a trend, and in the past, certainly there used to be where boaters used to have a display for radar, a display for a sounder, a display for chart plotter, right? Nowadays, boaters are maybe going to do redundancy, but they're going to do redundancy and still have maybe 2 displays, and they're going to, both displays are going to do radar, chart plotter, sounder, AIS targets. So we're not necessarily separating things and having dedicated devices for dedicated purposes, right? As a boater now we're saying, okay, well maybe I'll have a display up on the flybridge, a display on the lower helm, or a sailboat, I'm going to have a display inside the helm, at the outside helm, and one at the chart table. So some boaters are saying, you know what, yeah, I'm not going with a dedicated display per purpose. I'm going for maybe redundancies in displays, but most displays do multiple purposes. Yes, I've been on a boat where we ended up putting 8 chart plotters on a bridge, on one bridge, and yes, every single display was doing one thing, like locking your TV to just watch Fox or CNN or CBC, but you can, if you wanted, see radar on another display, right? It's a portal. Remember, that's what it is nowadays. Most of these displays are a portal to pretty much endless information. Whatever's on the network is going to be able to be seen on that display. And then the consideration that I brought about is, you know, do you have 1 or 2 helms? Are you going to have a chart plotter at your chart table if you have a sailboat? Depending on the type of boat, are you going to have 2 displays per helm? Again, a lot of choice. And obviously cost is a factor, right? And where you go. I can't stress that enough, you know. There's a big difference between a boater that does a day trip or one overnight and someone that's going to go on the outside of Vancouver Island or going to go up north where literally the first service call is at least a day or 2 days away. Right? So the further afield you go, the more you want to start considering redundancy, right? You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. You got to contemplate because things do break down. They just do. So you got to sort of plan for it and then consider what are going to be the redundancies for the navigation system on your boat. Another big sort of selection criteria that's important to consider nowadays is, am I going to go touchscreen? Am I going to go buttons? Or am I going to do a device that does both? Right? So for example, Raymarine was the first to come out with a device that does both touchscreen and buttons, right? Still to this day, Garmin doesn't do that. Well, maybe on the smaller stuff, but their big chart plotters are either touchscreen or they're not, right? So you choose. So that's one factor. Furuno's the same thing. So you got to decide, do I really, is this going to be an inside helm and I'm going to have warm, dry hands? Or am I a sailboater and I'm going to be outside and now I'm a racer, for example. Some people do racing at night. Well, if they're doing that, then it might make sense to get a display that you could maybe touch with your hands, but also with buttons, because in heavy seas, it's hard to touch the middle of a screen if it's a touch screen. So another big factor, and I was talking about that again this morning, is don't get too caught up in all these features that these devices offer. Over time, what I've noticed, including myself, and I'm a geek, is that we end up using a very small fraction of all the features that are available on a chart plotter, right? At the end of the day, what probably happens is you don't want to get too distracted. This is not a video game. You're not interfacing your chart plotter and your home on the couch. You've got to be navigating. You have to be a pilot, meaning you have to look at the screen and around you, right? You can't be so obsessed about this device. So people end up doing sort of the basics. So don't get too caught up about all the bells and whistles. Focus on what really works with the chart plotter. And yes, you can get carried away doing those things, but generally you do that away from shore, right? When you're sort of navigating and there's a lot of open water, there's not a lot of traffic, and then you might start going in the menu and really getting curious and doing all the cool things you can do. But generally most boaters will end up doing the basics. A chart plotter, they're going to decide their heading. Is it going to be course on ground heading? Is it going to be where the boat is pointing? Radar overlay maybe, AIS targets, right? Some cameras. But all the big features that are all possible, most of us, most of the time, are not going to be using those features. The other thing that's really nice today now is that a lot of the chart plotters come with this Wi-Fi capability on board. And remember, Wi-Fi is a local area network, meaning you could have Wi-Fi working on the dark side of the moon if you had a Wi-Fi router installed. Wi-Fi is used a lot and mistakenly confused with the internet. Wi-Fi has nothing to do with the internet. It's just a way to distribute the internet locally. So you could literally be in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and you could have a Wi-Fi network on your boat, and that Wi-Fi network would be just to interconnect a bunch of devices on your boat, but there would be no internet connectivity. Okay, so that's an important distinction to remember. And that's useful here for the Pacific Northwest, because there are certain places where we go, there is no internet. Even if you had a satellite connection, if you go to a place like Princess Louisa, where it's 6,000 feet of vertical cliffs, there's no satellite connection in Princess Louisa. It's a dark, it's simply, you just can't get it, which is good and bad. Always good and bad. And the other thing too is, especially for some of us that have older boats, like my boat is definitely older, when I decided to change my electronics on my boat and I had the simple instrument in my helm, I couldn't just assume, or I use this expression a lot, hope, that my single depth instrument at my helm was wired in a way to sufficiently now power a radar, a chart plotter, and AIS at my helm, right? So when you're actually doing all these upgrades on your boat or contemplating doing these upgrades, worry about the fact that the power wires at that helm 20 years ago were not thinking about powering everything humanly possible that you're now going to be doing at the helm. So that means you have to worry. You've got to ask yourself, is this little tiny gauge 18 wire going to be enough to power all the electronics on my helm? And the likely answer is no. And if you choose to ignore that advice, then welcome to a world of hurt, where your chart plotter works at the dock when you're connected to a battery charger, working when you have the alternator running, and I get service calls all summer, people telling me I'm sailing now, and my instruments stop working. They work at the dock, but they don't work while I'm underway sailing. And that's because the alternator is not working, there's too much voltage drop, and the electronics are dying when they need them. I mean, how scary. So trying something when your chart plotter is powered by a battery charger at the dock, right? Not really of any use, because you're using them out there. All right. So I put the list alphabetically. I mean, honestly, this is where people get sort of really, how shall I say that? They're very brand loyal. Sort of like someone that has a BMW might hate a Mercedes, or hate someone who has an Audi, or hate someone who has a Toyota. At the end of the day, the players that are left in the market are pretty much real players, right? There was other brands before, but nowadays, those are pretty established players. Yes, you can have a preference. Absolutely, most of us do. But I wouldn't say here that one of them is bad and the other one is great, okay? They're all offering, there's a piece of the pie, and they're all offering a different sort of niche or target audience, right? Because remember what I said, none of us are the same. They're trying to figure out, okay, I'm trying to hit as much of the market as possible, but they also know that not every boater is kind of different and they use their boat differently. So they're all defining and creating products that are trying to capture a portion of the market. There is no single chart plotter that is everything for everyone. If you're looking for that chart plotter, you're going to keep looking. You'll never find it. That's why there's a chart plotter for everyone, all of us, but it depends what line within each manufacturer. So B&G is for sailboaters, right? It's predominantly designed for sailboaters. We did a bunch of B&G systems in the fall and right now, and yeah, it's always going to go on a sailboat. You know, the software is tailored for that. It's part of the Navico family. So Navico is sort of a big company that owns both Simrad, well, three, Simrad, B&G, and Lowrance. Lowrance being fishing, B&G being sailing, Simrad being sort of yachting, right? So powerboats. So they've got sort of one big company owns, Common Engineering has 3 sub-brands for different markets. It totally makes sense, not crazy at all, right? And that's how, if you were going to divide the world in three different parts, fishing, sailboating, powerboating is not a bad way to look at it. Furuno comes back from, you'll see this, and we end up doing a lot of Furuno, and generally it's people that really want sort of that commercial level of reliability. You're going to pay somewhat a little bit of a premium for it. I have boaters that choose Furuno for the simple fact that they want their boat to look like a ship. I mean, as you'll see, Celine owners, North Oven owners, it's going to be Furuno. It's not even an option. You can't even have that discussion. You know, those boats, they want to look like a real boat, and so real boats in the harbor have Furuno. And so they're like, the big boats have Furuno? My big boat's got Furuno. And some people just want Furuno because that's what they want. It's part of what you'd expect on a big trawler. Furuno makes this product, and we'll talk a little bit about TZ Touch, pretty awesome. Again, maybe not, well, now it's certainly getting easier to use, but very reliable. I'd say that's probably the biggest thing with Furuno, is commercial grade in the marine recreational market. There's nothing that beats Furuno for reliability. It just isn't. Garmin, super easy to use. Garmin, a lot of people that have maybe an aviation background really like Garmin. I think Garmin's selling feature is definitely usability, right? And not too feature rich. A little bit maybe like an iPhone, right? Not having it too hard to use. Lowrance fishing, big time. Raymarine has got a big suite. It's been around for a long time. They've got 3 big product lines right now on the Axiom, different sort of products for different users. And they're also big proponents of sort of an iOS-like user experience. They've come a long way, and they're also owned by a company called FLIR, which does the thermal imaging cameras. And so they've got really good integration with FLIR cameras. And lastly, Simrad. We've done a bunch of Simrad as well, more for yachting, not the sailboaters. And we'll be looking at some of their displays as well. Simrad and B&G ended up following Raymarine's lead of doing displays that are both touchscreen, which is nice, intuitive, and also having everything doable by the side with buttons. So you don't have to pick and choose if you want touchscreen or buttons. They'll actually have a device that does both. So you can interface everything on the screen, or you can interface everything via the buttons. So for sailboaters, especially with wet helms, that's something to consider about. Like, I have some sailboaters that only sail, you know, July and August, and if it's raining, they're not really going out, and they're not in big seas, so a touchscreen doesn't matter. But if you're going offshore, or you're sailing in the middle of the night, and you're a racer, and you're actually got spray in the cockpit, using a touchscreen with wet hands can be a little bit frustrating, okay? Especially also cold hands. So this is Furuno's got all these big displays, and they also have this thing, BB means black box. MFD means multifunctional display, okay? Meaning it's a portal to multiple things. So the good thing too to consider is that a lot of these new displays from all manufacturers now have what's called an NMEA 2000 port at the back. This is sort of like a USB, okay, for computers, meaning it's a CAN bus port, and that CAN bus port, which is NMEA 2000, allows the integration of multiple things on one display. So for example, if you have a recently new outboard or engine, you can actually interconnect your engine and show all those gauges and information on the screen. You could same thing with do a weather station. You could do engine monitoring. We converted a 100-footer had old engines, and we converted the 3 generators and the 2 engines to NMEA 2000. The gauges stayed the same. The analog gauges, there's analog gauges in the engine room, there's analog gauges upper helm and lower helm. We didn't touch those, but we digitized all that information, and now they can see that information on their Furuno screens, and on top of it, then they can Wi-Fi in and see those gauges anywhere on the boat. So this whole digitization sort of track is possible with any of those displays nowadays. NMEA 2000 came out in the late 2000s, and it's full throttle at this point. Raymarine has got a whole suite. This is sort of the Axiom Pro. You'll see that there's actually buttons on the side. In the Pacific Northwest, where the water is colder, and with our hands, because it's not always beautiful and sunny outside, as we know, we're doing a lot of the Axiom Pros. But there's 3 lines of Axioms. You can see them. Raymarine has a booth here at the boat show, and you can see the whole product line of Raymarine. You'll notice in the middle they're showing icons, sort of you can press on the icon, a little bit like the apps, right, on an iOS. Same thing with other phones as well. This concept of I want to go see radar, I want to go see chart plotter, I want to see my AIS targets, right? Because like I said, remember, there's a lot of things that are possible on a chart plotter, but at the end of the day, most of us are going to not do all of it all the time, right? You're going to go down to the basics, right? You're not going to geek out too much while you're navigating. You got to look up, right? Look at the horizon, scan, constantly be on the alert, right? Especially around here for deadheads, other boaters, paddle boarders, fishing boats that do sort of these tracks that you wouldn't expect, right? Because they're not going anywhere, they're fishing. So you got to be on the lookout. So you want to look at your device, but you want to kind of pan the horizon and behind you. An example of a Garmin. When you're doing displays, and I wanted to show this image, there's multiple ways of obviously mounting displays. A lot of them are being flush mounted, but nowadays you can even do on a lot of the bigger displays, even 16 inches on actually a U-bracket, right? On some boats it makes sense. We've got to remember, like in the 1980s and early 90s, nobody was actually creating these huge display mounts. They never expected that you'd have these displays that could be mounted. They were used to be CRTs, they were this deep, right? So like you think about a Grand Banks, things were all mounted on trunnion brackets. Everything was a U-bracket. It's only now that the boats are actually coming with flat surface areas where we can actually do a cutout, and the display is only maybe an inch thick or 2-inch or 3-inch thick in depth, right? So on a lot of boats, we end up still using U-brackets because there's no other place. There's not a single surface area where I can just do a cutout and put a 16-inch screen in there. I'm trying to emphasize here all these different sort of screen sizes that you can buy. There's a 7-inch, 9-inch, 12-inch, 16-inch, right? And you can actually, I can tell you this, no joke. I've never, ever, ever heard a boater tell me, Jeff, I only wish I did a smaller screen. You know, in hindsight, God damn it. You know, if I could have only done something smaller, yeah, you know what, at that time, I wish I did it. Never happened. Now, I'm not saying you're going to go from a 7 to a 16, but look at the one size up. And what happens is people tell me, oh, well, I'm going to zoom in and zoom out. You know what? Humans are efficient with their energy. It's another way of saying they're lazy. And you're not going to be zooming in, zooming out as much as you think. You're going to set it to the scale that you're thinking, and you're going to leave it there. And then what you're going to do is like, I got this. You're going to tell yourself, I know all of this stuff here. I don't need to see around because I've been there. Because it's too far away. You're holding the helm. It's not comfortable. You're like, yeah, I've been there. It's not the right chart scale, but I'm okay. And it reminds me of a client of mine who shared that story with me, and it was an amazing, humbling story. And there's no point of laughing because it's a lesson for all of us. This owner had sailed around the world twice, 12 years. And guess where he literally hit a rock? Coming back from Stanley Park from watching the fireworks one night. Had done the route hundreds of times, but was overly confident, right? And that's the risk when we're boaters, is to be overly confident. And if you've got a chart plotter that you're zooming in, zooming out all the time because the display's too small, you're going to be ended up not, and then you want to start panning, right? Because you're not looking at the right scale in the right place. You want to look forward. And now you're using the D-pad and you're moving forward, or you're flickering the street and like, oh, where am I? Now you got to get back out. So if you're considering a 9-inch, look at a 12. Because then what I end up doing is I recommend doing 2 side-by-side screens, chart to chart, one zoomed in, one zoomed out. And then that way you're looking at the right scale at the right time at the same time. Very neat. So when we're boating on our boat, we have a 12-inch screen, and we literally have a mode where we're like literally having a 300 range on one, and then a 0.8 nautical mile on the other. So I'm looking right close to everything around my boat, and I've got everything sort of far enough away so that I have a perspective. A big Simrad screen. Same, I mean, everyone's sort of following the common sense approach, which is the iOS icons, right? Trying to make it easy to go, I want to see radar, I want to see a chart plotter. Okay, so what we're going to look at, so first of all, you can still buy chart plotters only, and I had that happen a few times where people didn't do their homework, bought a chart plotter, and then later on, it was a great price point, amazing price point, like sub 1,000, 500, 700. They're like, now I'm ready for radar. And they install the radar and they go to plug it in the back and they're like, there's no place for the radar port. There's no network port. And like, no, that's a chart plotter sounder only. It's not compatible for a radar, right? So again, think, even though you might not do a radar today, if you decide that you're not going to do a radar ever, make sure that you look forward enough and say, oh, I'm not going to do a radar ever, okay. But if you're going to do a radar later, make sure that your chart plotter has also radar compatibility, so that you can plug in a radar later on. We're going to talk about a little bit the difference between a vector and a raster chart. I've got 2 images, but in a nutshell, what that means is a vector chart is a digitization of a paper-based chart. It means that they're actually, you can add and remove elements. When you zoom in or you zoom out, there's different information. You can make the water red, you can make it purple, you can do whatever you want. All the data is completely, you can manipulate it however you want. A raster chart is an image. You can't really, you're not photoshopping the image. You're either zooming in, zooming out, and that's it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We mentioned screen size, how important it is to make a decision now to consider that price point. It might not be much more money. And here's another takeaway. The horizon for all of us for navigation equipment is honestly minimum 10 years, minimum 10, probably 15, maybe 20. That's a long time zone. Like, I have no one that says to me, I spent a bunch of money 5 years ago, I'm refreshing my electronics. I don't care how much money they've got in their pocket, they're spending on something else. 5-year-old electronics is brand new electronics. No one, it's never happened. Never, not a single time. 10 years is sort of the minimum, 15 is average, and 20 happens. So remember, that's a long decision. That's a 20-year commitment, because it's a lot of money up front to put it all in. So whatever you decide, think about it. You're not going to be, it's not like our iPhones or smartphones where we're changing them every couple years, every 3 years or 4 years. This is a 15-year sort of commitment. The other thing, depending on the type of boat you have, you might end up going with a black box. A black box is sort of, it's a computer, and it sits somewhere else, and then you sort of have these monitors, like at home, and you might have a Hatlin display, which obviously is going to have really good low light, because at night you want to have really low light, touchscreen, but you might decide to break up and have a black box that does sort of 2 displays. And we talked about the difference between buttons, touch, and hybrid. So here's what a vector chart looks like, right? It sort of looks cartoonish. It was digitized. And so there was literally probably an army of people that were digitizing these paper charts and making raster vector charts. Companies that do that are Navionics, and then also Garmin did that, right? CMAP did that, and Raymarine's even doing it as well in the States. They're digitizing sort of what's free information from NOAA, or here in Canada, CHS, and they're digitizing this paper-based charts to a vector chart. Here's what looks a raster chart. I mean, I find that beautiful. I mean, that could be a frame on a wall. I'm always going to love raster. It sort of have that feeling. It's common. We know what it looks like, but it's a paper-based chart. And you're just zooming in, zooming out. So as you're zooming out, they can't remove elements. You're just seeing further and further away, like looking at a chart farther and farther away. All right, with that, we're going to start on sounders, sonars, fish finders, different words meaning sort of the same thing. Besides propulsion, steering, right? Two separate things. Obviously, hull integrity is another one. Hull integrity, propulsion, steering, VHF radio, depth sounder. It's got to be top 5 thing in your boat. Depth sounder, you cannot go boating without one. You need to know what the depth is. Charts don't always tell you the truth. That's a reality. The soundings might be off. They thought it was that. They told you it was that, but it isn't that. So you might as well know what it is. What's the depth underneath your boat? So everyone needs a depth sounder. And beyond a depth sounder now, we have transducers that have the ability, and we'll see images, that you could actually see literally a ship underwater. You could see a tree underwater. It's not just showing you depth. It's literally imaging the bottom under your boat. Sweeping to the side, sweeping forward. There's all these different possibilities with transducers nowadays. But at the very least, you need a depth sounder that shows you bottom depth. Okay? When you're buying a transducer, you've got different choices. One of them is a through-hull transducer, which through-hull and a transom mount off, because the transducers are in the water, offer you by far the best quality. And you can also do what's called an in-hull transducer. That means it's glued on the inside of the hull, but it's like talking through a wall. Someone on the other side might hear you, but there's obviously going to be a lot of signal loss talking through a solid wall. You can't have air gaps, so it has to be fiberglass, right? Solid fiberglass. And we'll do that sometimes for a boater that says, Jeff, I've spent, here we're doing my nav, but I'm not hauling out until a year later or in 8 months. Let's put in a really inexpensive in-hull transducer, short term, because it's a couple $100, $150, $250. Let's put it in, and then next time I haul out, then we'll put in the through-hull transducer, and we're going to do it properly. I would never, ever recommend a through-hull or in-hull transducer as a primary transducer for someone that's going really far afield. You know, we need depth. Depth is not a gadget. You don't want to lose your bottom be sort of flaky. Because remember, the water column, what's beneath your boat also affects, like if you're in a river, for example, that has a lot of sand or coming out of you're in the ocean, but for example, here we have a large river, the Fraser, or if you're up north and all these huge rivers that have lots of silt coming out, sand that's suspended, you're going to lose your bottom a lot sooner than you would when the ocean is clear water, right? So you could actually have a lot of debris suspended in the water column, and that's going to affect the ability of your transducer to read the bottom. So the stronger the transducer, if the transducer is actually in the water, means that you're not going to have any sort of power loss by going through a hull. Here's an example of a through hull with a fairing block. Pretty common. Here's an example of a pretty big transom mount transducer. So that's really popular on, obviously not sailboats, fishing boats, power boats up to about probably 35-ish, right? But you need an ability to kick it back down. So if you don't have a way to, sometimes you'll hit a debris and it's going to pop up. You won't know it popped up. You're just going to get a funny reading, right? So that transducer, because there's a lot of debris in the water around here, you could actually have it kicked up while you're underway. So sometimes you need a way to actually push it back so it's parallel, right, with the water, so it's shooting straight down. You don't want it to be shooting down like this because you're reading a completely different, first of all, you're reading behind your boat, which is not good. And that distance is much longer than the distance straight down. So generally you're going to see those in the 20, 30 foot range. 30 is sort of the end. Maybe you've got a big Grady White, we might see that. But generally, if at one point you might find it an annoyance to actually have to worry about if my transducer constantly parallel. So you're going to say, screw it, I just want it mounted in the hull, always looking down, because I'm pretty sure my boat is always level, right? And so then you end up leaving the transom mount transducer. Here's an example of an image of a in-hull transducer, and it can actually even be mounted for the offset because most of our hulls are not flat, right? So you might have a hull that's like this, and so you can actually adjust the degrees to make for the offset. You even now have literally true hull transducers that the element, your transducer might be installed like this, the hull's like here, but the transducer has a tilted element inside and it's shooting down like here. So your transducer is actually, you think shooting off to the side, but it actually isn't. Inside the element is actually tilted to offset for your dead rise of your hull. And that's a way to avoid fairing blocks. So we do these sort of mushroom transducers that are coming in, I don't have an image, that are coming in and they're offset by 12 degrees, 20 degrees, you know. Raymarine makes all these different types of offset transducers so you don't have to have a fairing block to offset for the dead rise of your hull. Now, in the past, you know, you think about these instruments, we had simple instruments that would show a depth number, right? The transducer would be plugged directly into that instrument, pretty straightforward. And then fish finders came out, and then we needed a black box. Something needed to understand what was going on. There needed to be a brain to translate all this information and send it to the chart plotter so the chart plotter would have something that we humans could understand. Nowadays, you can actually buy a lot of chart plotters and have that intelligence right into the chart plotter itself. So that means that you can connect literally a transducer port directly into the back of the chart plotter, multifunction display, and have the device translate all that information and show you a sounding image with bottom profile and fish. Now, some of you might have a chart plotter that doesn't have that capability. It wasn't bought with it. Like Garmin sells chart plotters with transducer ports and without. But now you're saying, oh, now I want a depth sounder. I want a fish finder. Well, then what you're going to end up doing is you're going to end up buying a black box sounder to be networked to your chart plotter. So you can always do it later, okay? Here's a sort of simple instrument showing depth. Even on big boats, we do this all the time on trawlers. I'll have a huge suite of navigation electronics at the main helm, and then at the brow, I'm going to start having sort of like get me home electronics. Things that are simple, like a GPS, depth, you know, like some redundancy. You know, because you can always go home if you've got a, you know, a GPS and a depth sounder. It's nice to have chart plotters, and all, but if something ever goes awry, you want to get home, you have redundancy. Even on my sailboat, I've got a chart plotter and I have a fish finder, but I also have another breaker on my panel that just lights up my instruments. And my instruments are wind and depth. And I leave that on 24/7, even at anchor. I want to know what the wind speed is, and I alarm for wind speed, because you end up dragging at high wind speed. And I want to know what my depth is, because I'm always worried about hitting bottom. That's something I never stop worrying about. I'm constantly, because you're swinging an anchorage, right? You never know what the bottom could be like. And I'm constantly looking at my depth like I'm obsessed. And I do that throughout the day. What's my depth? What's my depth? Did I give my enough room for the tide? Some places like here, the tides are pretty huge. 12, 15-foot tides are not uncommon. Further north, 25-foot tides. I mean, those are extreme. Some places only 2-3 feet, right, in the Caribbean. But here in the Pacific Northwest, a 10-foot tide, 12-foot tide, pretty commonplace. Some days it's 18 feet tides, right? So you can have a lot of water when you came in, but 6 hours from now, it could be 18 feet lower. So having a depth sounder as a backup somewhere, or something that you leave on all the time, depending on what type of boating you do, if you're at the dock, you won't have to worry as much. Dock to dock to dock is easy, right? But if you're anchoring, a depth sounder and always on is nice to consider. This is a traditional sounder. That means 50 and 200. 50 goes deeper, 200 is wider. So you imagine a cone, right, coming from an element. It's sort of like a cone goes in all directions. 50 allows you to go deeper, and 200 allows you to see wider. Chirp, that's compressed high intensity irradiated pulse. I mean, forget about the name, you just chirp. At the end of the day, a lot of boaters are going with chirp because not only they're able to see it's sort of like a sweeping beam of frequencies, right? So it doesn't just output one frequency, it does a sweep, and it's constantly going through that sweep. So they're looking for multiple sort of echoes. So that's where you can start literally seeing a tree. Like they have these cool pictures of places where they filled up a reservoir or a dam, they dammed an area. You can see a bridge, a house that got, literally flooded. You can see trees that were, again, flooded. You can see all of that on the side of your boat. So that's kind of the side view, right? And then you can also see some of them are forward looking now. So it's a little bit like having radar. It's a be able to see underneath your boat, and it's really popular obviously with the fishing crowds, right? Or I have forward looking people that are going really further ashore, outside of Vancouver Island, Queen Charlotte's, Alaska, and they're going in sort of sketchy anchorages, right? And that's sort of their thrill, right? They could do the easy one, but they want to get into the one that it's hard to get into. And so they'll install a forward scan transducer, right? And they'll even do side sweeps to figure out where are the ledges around their boat when they're anchoring, right? So they can see that it gets shallower, because sometimes it might be 40 feet underneath your boat here, but 20 feet to the side, it's only 10 feet, right? It's not a rock, it's just a ledge. So that's why some of these different types of transducers are useful not only for fish finding, but also for gunk holing, right? Going away from the beaten track. And that's the pleasure I find as a boater. I mean, it's easy to go to certain places that are huge holes, right? Tons of boats, and there'll be 300 boats in the summer, and it's easy. You drop the hook, you're done. But if you're willing to be a little bit more courageous and go in a more technical anchorage, then there's only another boat there, or you're the only boat there. So if you like, if you want to be surrounded with a lot of people, generally those are the easy anchorages, the anchorages that are less demanding technically. And if you want to be alone, the way to be alone is by being willing to take on a little bit more complicated anchoring locations, and that, or deeper water or whatnot, and you can be in an amazing place, and there's 300 boats a nautical mile away, and you're by yourself, so close, you didn't go far, but you're just willing to take on a harder anchorage. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is why radar. As a boater, I can tell you that I have never left the dock with fog. That's never happened. I've never intentionally said, I can't see further than the bow of my boat, let's go boating. Never done that. Some people do, I'm not laughing, some people don't care. I've never done that. But I can tell you as a boater, I've been countless times enveloped, surrounded by fog that was not predicted to be foggy. And I saw a fog band at the horizon later when you're underway. I'm a sailboat, I can't outrun it, I'm not doing 40 knots. And literally you can see it at the horizon, and it's coming. And you see it, it's a white wall. And you're like, it's coming. And sure enough, it happened underway. In the summer month, in August, it's not supposed to be foggy, there's generally no fog there. But sure enough, as a boater, it's 99 days of bliss and the 1 day of sheer terror. And if you haven't lived the day of sheer terror, just wait. It will happen. And that's why radar is it's comforting to have, because when you're surrounded by fog, it's like being senseless. It means that your hearing's not the same, you can't see. It just feels like you're without your senses. It's terrifying. It literally is terrifying. What radar gives you is it gives you the ability, because you know where you are, obviously, with your GPS. The challenge is the other boats around you, right? Those boats are not on your chart plotter. They're not only there if they're transmitting their position via AIS, we'll talk about that a little bit later, or you're picking them up with your radar. So I have boaters that say to me, well, I don't need a radar because when I'm motoring, I know where I am because I have my GPS. I'm like, you're absolutely right. If there is not a single boat out there, you'll get home with a chart plotter only in radar, in fog, no problem. But you're assuming that there's not an idiot out there that's decided to go full throttle like it actually happened to me. No joke, that fog bank that came up, full radar, everything radar overlay. There was a powerboat that missed our bow by about 200. We actually used the foghorn, full throttle, about 35 knots. They were screaming, Russian roulette style. Let's see what happens. No joke. We actually stopped our boat. We would have been on a collision course, so I MARPA acquired them. I actually acquired the target. They were coming super fast. Who does 35 knots in fog? I mean, you're living in the moment. You know, life is good now. And tomorrow, we'll see. But right now, it's pretty damn good. So right now, for them, they were a happy place. 35 knots. I'm like, what the hell is going on? Who's going 35 in fog? Target, we're like collision course. Stop the boat. I have time to go downstairs, pull a foghorn. I've never used my foghorn before. Pull out, and they pass about 200 feet in front of our bow, screaming, woo, doing 35 knots. Can you imagine not having my radar? It would be crazy. You're blind without radar. So radar is one of those things where once you live that fog sort of being around you, enveloping you, you go, I need a radar. Generally, you don't need a radar until you do. And when that happens, you come back and you're like, yeah, so we're doing a radar upgrade. Otherwise, the missus is never coming out boating again. So it's going to be a couple seasons where she's not going to be coming because she likes the grandkids. And this whole boating thing is pleasure boating, not like, we've got a good life here, right? Like, so we're doing a radar. I'm like, oh yeah, good, yeah. So consider radar up front rather than after you need it. So here's an example of what's amazing about a radar overlay. And what makes radar so easy nowadays is that you're literally putting all the radar image on top of your chart, right? So you're lining up, your chart is this, and your radar is lining up like that. And what that tells you right away is anything that's not on land is something of interest, right? So it tells you right away what are the things that you don't need to worry about and what are the things you should worry about. So anything that's not charted is an object of interest. Why is that object on the water? It's probably a boat. Is it moving? Is it a fishing boat practically not moving? Is it mooching off the bottom? Some fishing boats don't move. They're just there, mooching off the bottom. Some fishing boats barely move. They're moving a knot. Ferries are coming in at 20 knots. Freighters are 25 knots. You've got people that have got nothing to live for. They're coming at 35 knots, right? So you've got all these different boaters out there, and as a radar, what it does with the overlay, it tells you right away what are the targets you should be worried about. So radars come in two different sort of flavors. One is a radome radar. So I've got 4 examples here from Furuno, Raymarine, B&G, Garmin. Simrad's the same thing like B&G, it looks the same. So that's sort of an array that is generally about 18 inches, this big, or 24 inches. And there's an array inside, and it's about this high. And you'll see them on radar poles, you'll see them on radar towers, on massive sailboats, right? They're not too heavy. And yeah, probably about to 50 feet. Probably you're going to end up seeing them. And the array, remember, is only 18 inches. And the wider the array, right, the longer, that's why the big ships, think about it, the more they have depth of vision, right? The wider our eyes are, the better your depth perception is. If you cover one eye, your world is not 3D anymore, right? Everything becomes simply 2D. There's no depth perception. So the bigger the array, the better depth perception you're going to have. And then you can start separating targets that would otherwise be seen as one cluster. That's why the big boats have really big arrays, right? Really, really big arrays. Because they can see things that otherwise would be obstructed in front of another, right? So that's what an open array looks like. They start about this size, right? And then they go as big as you want. Well, as big as you want. 12 feet, but you never see that on a pleasure boat. But 6 feet array, 8 feet array is not uncommon. 4 feet array, definitely not uncommon. So when you're thinking about nowadays, what's amazing about this new technology, there's these sort of solid state radars. So I think one of the challenges that we all had as pleasure boaters is that it's hard to understand a radar screen. Honestly, if you don't use it, it's pretty hard. So one piece of advice that I have for boaters is always use radar when you don't need them. Like I use radar every day that I'm boating, and I use it to anchor. Literally, what's the distance between my boat and other boats? What's the distance between my boat and shore? I'm using it all the time. I want to start estimating distances. And I want to know what boats look like when I turn on radar. What am I getting back? Because remember, I'm going to need it one day when I'm blind, when it's either pitch dark outside or I'm, again, full fog. And now what these solid state radars are doing is they're actually doing sort of auto MARPA. They're actually looking at targets coming towards you and putting them in red, and targets that are moving away from you are going in green. So they're actually trying to make understanding radar easier now. Commercial operators only operate a boat with radar. That's it. There's nothing else. Charts, it's radar, 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 radar. And practice makes perfect. If you end up using radar only when that sheer day of terror and use it once every second or third year, you're going to use it, but you're not going to know how to use it. So one thing to consider is for sure radar overlay makes it easier. Modern radars that start acquiring targets automatically, color coding the ones that are moving towards you, that are on a collision course, and also using it all the time. Using it every day that you're out boating. I use it to look at the ferries, look at the freighters. I'm curious. Have the radar overlay on. Oh yeah, look at that boat. Oh yeah, that's a pretty big image. Yeah. Oh yeah, there, look at them. I light it up in English Bay where there's so many freighters anchored. Yeah, where are all the boats? Yeah, that makes sense. That boat, that boat, that boat, that boat. When I pass close to one, what does it look like when I'm close to a big freighter? It's one thing when a freighter's 1,000 meters, a mile away, but what happens when a freighter's literally 300 foot to your side that's just simply anchored? What does that look on the chart with a radar overlay? Practice, or good practice, makes perfect. All right, AIS. AIS stands for Automatic Identification System. And it's a way for boats to transmit not only their location, but also their speed on ground, their course on ground, which is where they're going, how fast they're going somewhere, their boat name, the width of the boat, the length of the boat. They can even on stern transport, they'll tell you their destination, when they expect to be to port. And so you can actually know, hey, big boat over there, who are you? Here's me. You can actually call the boat. You literally see their boat name and say, by the way, I'm navigating, I'm letting you through. You can start calling someone by their name and saying, hey, you, right? Because now it's showing up on your chart plotter and you have sort of like a business card, an identification card for every boat that is transmitting AIS. Now, as a boater, you might not be transmitting, but you can also be receiving. At least you see them, they don't see you, right? It's a first step of having AIS is having a receiver only. And the next step is being a transponder. So you transmit your position and they receive. I have boaters that say, Jeff, on Friday, I'd rather my transmitter not be transmitting. I don't want people in my office, my staff, to know that I'm boating. Can I be on silent mode? I'm like, absolutely. You can go silent on Friday. Saturday, suddenly you're going to show up at an anchorage, but on Friday, you were nowhere to be seen. So yes, you can go silent. The other thing too is I have boaters that have maybe boat partners. They're 2 partners, 3 partners, 4 partners on a boat, and they're meeting. They're exchanging the boat in different places. But sometimes you can't communicate with the boat partner. Are they on their way? Are they making progress? You can actually go on a phone, have an app, literally look at any boat in the world and see them on your phone, and they could be in the Browns. And well, I haven't been able to reach Mike, but yeah, he's underway and he's going to port and everything's on schedule. Or your partner might be looking as simply your wife or husband. She might be looking and saying, I wonder if they made it to anchor last night. I didn't hear from them, but I wonder, did they make it to anchor? They forgot to call me. I haven't spoken to them. You can literally look on your app, see they're like, yeah, they're anchored in such and such bay. They told me they were going there. Things must be pretty good if they're anchored and they're in where they intended to be. So it's a way for boaters to stay in touch. You might be looking for a friend. We're going up to Desolation Sound. Where are they? Oh yeah, they're in I don't know, Aprito Haven. Oh, they're in Cortez Bay. Okay, perfect. Oh, we'll reach out to channel maybe 66 when we get closer. Again, if you want to go silent, you can, no problem. But if you want to share your information with other boaters, you can do that as well. Now, it's obviously vessel to vessel and vessel to shore. That's how the shore gets the information, and then they upload it via the internet. And then you download via the internet. It's not real time, so I don't recommend people to navigate AIS with a phone. This is not a navigation tool. There's a delay there, okay? So imagine you walking around and having your sight telling you information around you 10, 15, 20 seconds later. There'd be a lot of bumping into people if the delay, there was a 10 seconds or even 5-second delay between what you see and what you're processing. You cannot make any sort of navigation decisions without having instantaneous information of where boats are and where boats are going. Here's an example of the boat right here, and then you see an AIS target right over here. They show up as a triangle. You got another triangle over here, another triangle over here, another triangle over here. And so they're trying to avoid each other right now, right? They're coming in sort of a congested navigable waterway. And you'll see that a lot, like around here in the Pacific. We've got a lot of boats happening in the Strait of Georgia. There's boats that are going to English Harbor, they're anchoring. There's boats that are leaving. You can actually light up an AIS far away from even under, like, I don't know, you could be 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles, and you'll have all those AIS targets show up on your chart plotter, which is really nice to figure out. Sometimes there's places around here where we have really tight passes, and you'll see big boats on the other side. I remember just recently, we were coming through a pass, and I was telling my partner, we've got to wait. There's 2 tugboats on the other side. It's their turn, and sure enough, we stopped, and we could have gone through that pass. It's called Dodds Narrows, but it's a really tight pass. You can't see the other side. Sure enough, I waited. I looked like crazy. Why am I waiting? But they came in with their log booms, 1, 2, and then we took our turn, and then we went through the pass. So those are basically some of the, you can see local commercial traffic, you can plan narrow passages under bridge, right? Constriction of areas, because here in the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of that, and you can have collision alarms. And with that, I think it's going to be my last slide. So here's a big takeaway. When you buy an AIS, you can buy them as receiver, and you can buy it as transponder and receiver. If you buy an AIS transponder, it's going to come with a GPS. Why? Because everything needs to be time-stamped. They need to know that you are where you are when you are. So every single AIS transponder, doesn't matter if it's Amtrak, Vesper, it could be Furuno, it could be Simrad, it could be Raymarine, it could be Garmin, all come with their own dedicated GPS antenna so that everything is time-stamped, so they know where you are when you say you are, okay? We've got a couple minutes for questions before we go on to the next presentation. Anybody here have questions on navigation equipment or what we talked about? Yes?
Dedicated antenna, VHF antenna, or splitter? What do you recommend?
Yeah, so the question up front was dedicated VHF antenna or AIS antenna or a splitter. It really depends, because as a sailboater, the advantage is you have tall masts. So a sailboater would generally go with a splitter because about range. If you've got a big power boat, and you could put an antenna on port side, and for reasons of symmetry, you've got room on the starboard side, you might end up putting an AIS antenna on starboard and a VHF antenna on port. But some big power boats already have a VHF for lower helm and a VHF for upper helm on already port and starboard. So that's where you might end up doing a splitter. And they're active splitter, digital splitters, so there's no real like line loss. It depends. There's no easy way of, ideally, dedicated antenna. Ideally, if you had a boat with 2 masts at opposite ends of the boat, not in the same plane, you'd have 2 antennas. But then the problem is, do you have the ability or the time to route a second antenna, right? And how many boats have 2 masts, not at the same level, separated away from each other? Not that many. Yes, another question?
You're setting up an AIS system. How do you input the information?
Yeah, so good question. How do you end up inputting the AIS information about the boat name, MMSI, the width of your boat, the length of your boat? All that has to be done either through an app. Literally, like Vesper, for example, you actually go in via an app that you download from the internet, log in via Bluetooth Wi-Fi, and then you do that, or you'll do it through a computer. Okay? With that, I'm upstairs at the booth there the whole weekend. So if you've got more questions about electronics, you can meet me up there. And also at the end of the next presentation, anybody who's got questions, I'll take questions as well. So thank you everyone for being here today. I appreciate it.